Hello, everyone. Does this work? Thank you for coming. So today we have Professor Cecilia Heyes, who is visiting us from Oxford. I think Cecilia is going to give us quite a unique viewpoint on the subject matter of social perception and mind reading today, because she has quite the multidisciplinary background. She's studied philosophy, experimental psychology, animal behavior, human behavior, and even neuroscience in both the United States and here in the UK. She's done most of her work at University College London, here in London, but is now at All Souls College in Oxford. And I'll give it to Cecilia.
Thank you very much, Nick and Patrick, and thank you all for coming. I feel very honored to have been invited to give this keynote, and I'm going to talk about mind reading, which almost certainly most of you know does not mean telepathy. I'm not going to be talking about anything spooky, but rather about our capacity to interpret our own behavior and the behavior of other people in terms of mental states, of thoughts and feelings. So, of course, this is the standard way in which we interpret behavior, our own and that of other people, in everyday life. Whenever you ask the question, why did he or why did she do that, the answer that you get or that you give yourself typically refers to thoughts and feelings. So she raised her hand because she wanted the auctioneer to notice that she was bidding for the painting, or she hid the evidence because she thought it was incriminating. This is our standard way of explaining behavior in everyday life. And it's sometimes known as folk psychology or theory of mind, but I'm going to call it mind reading because I want to argue that mind reading is very like print reading or literacy. That just like print reading, we aren't born with a special mental gadget that enables us to do it. That is mind reading. That we do not learn how to do it through our own efforts, but rather that we are taught how to read minds, to interpret behavior in terms of thoughts and feelings, the way that we are taught how to read print, how to become literate. So that's where I'm aiming for. And I want to start by giving you a little background as to why I'm interested in mind reading, which is going to be background relating to the evolution of human cognition. Then I'm going to get stuck into this direct comparison between print reading and mind reading. And then I'm going to focus on evidence that we are taught to read minds. So to start with the evolutionary background, okay, oh, that's a surprise. There we are, okay. I suppose you could describe me as an evolutionary psychologist, and like all evolutionary psychologists, the basic question that interests us is, what makes humans such peculiar kinds of animals? And very broadly speaking, evolutionary psychologists offer two kinds of answer to this question. So one group, I'm having a lot of trouble with this remote mouse. Okay. What makes us such peculiar animals? These pictures are just designed to remind you of what peculiar animals we are. Even our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, they lead reasonably interesting social lives, and they're able to use sticks and stones as tools, but their lives really are very different from ours. Our lives with our built environment, agriculture, science and technology, arts and humanities, complex political and economic systems, completely unlike anything which is found in any other animals, including our closest relatives. So why are we so peculiar? Evolutionary psychologists offer two broadly different answers to this question. People like Steven Pinker, one of what's sometimes known as high church evolutionary psychologists, offer the answer, it's inborn innate modules. That humans are born with a large number of special purpose psychological gadgets. And through the use of those gadgets, the metaphor is the Swiss Army knife, which of course has a lot of special purpose gadgets on it. Through these inborn psychological gadgets, humans are able to work out how to deal with the world in ways that no other animals can. On the other hand, cultural evolutionists, as they're called, offer a somewhat different answer to that question. Essentially, they say what makes humans such peculiar animals is the way in which we are able to learn in our lifetimes the accumulated wisdom of all previous generations of humans. So it is what we learn from others which makes us lead such peculiar lives. Now, these are two pretty different answers to the question, but the two groups of people, the high church evolutionary psychologists who believe in innate modules, and the cultural evolutionists who think that it's accumulated wisdom of many generations, have something in common, which is some version of the Swiss Army knife. Can you see? Yeah, just about visible, isn't it? Okay. So the cultural evolutionists think that the psychological processes which make it possible for us to learn from others, make it possible for us to learn the accumulated wisdom of previous generations, those psychological processes are innate modules. They are inborn psychological processes which we genetically inherit. So in a way, the cultural evolutionists believe in a Swiss Army knife of special cognitive gadgets. It's just that they think that these special gadgets are for varieties of what's known as cultural learning. I'll say a little bit more about cultural learning in a moment. So this is the standard story upheld by both the high church evolutionary psychologists and the cultural evolutionists. They say, look, there's genetic evolutionary processes, the basic processes of biological evolution. Those have produced psychological processes which are specialized for cultural learning, for learning from others. And those processes of cultural learning are an analog of the processes of genetic inheritance, which allow cultural evolution to happen. This is the standard story. But what I've been doing in the last few years is investigating an alternative story which suggests that the contribution of genetic evolution to the development of cultural learning is a lot less and a lot less specific than has been assumed, and that these processes of cultural learning don't only make cultural evolution possible, they are also themselves products of cultural evolution. There's a wheel within a wheel here. My slogan is, not only the grist, also the mills. So the idea is that it's not only that we learn from others facts about the world and skills for dealing with the world, how to make spears, how to make fire, how to make bread, how to make computers. That would be cultural inheritance of grist. We also learn from others in the course of development how to learn the grist from others. We build psychological processes in the course of development through the influence of other people, which, once we, as it were, download them from our culture, enable us to learn lots of facts and skills from others. So it's a wheel within a wheel suggestion, or bootstrapping suggestion. Now let me get a bit more concrete about what these processes of cultural learning are. There's a whole variety of them. Language obviously contributes to cultural inheritance of information, to learning from others, but also imitation, copying the actions of others, normative psychology, being able to think in terms of what one should do, a whole bunch of varieties of social learning in which individuals can learn by observing the behavior, the nonverbal behavior of others, psychological functions which are thought to depend on mirror neurons, most famously action understanding, psychological processes that make infants and children selectively trustful, more willing to learn from some adults than from others, or under some circumstances rather than others, and my focus today, mind reading. So with all of these different processes, I'm working my way through them, sifting the evidence from non-human animals, from human infants, and from adults, asking what is the evidence that the capacity to do these things is genetically rather than culturally inherited. So let's begin to look at mind reading. This is a particularly interesting kind of cultural learning because it contributes to so many other kinds of cultural learning. So something like imitation, copying of body movements. I think mind reading does not explain how we are able to copy the body movements of others, but it does help to explain why we choose to copy on some occasions and not on others. So, for example, if I see somebody waving, do I wave back? Do I copy them or not? It depends on my interpretation of why I think they're waving. You know, do I think they're waving at me? Do they intend to attract my attention? Do they intend to greet me? That's all mind reading. Mind reading is also very important in the pragmatics of language, but perhaps most crucially, mind reading is important for teaching. Imagine if you're trying to teach something to somebody, you need to have an idea of what it is they already know in order to be able to assess what you need to show them or to tell them. Similarly, children later in development, it's beneficial when they are being taught if they are able to represent what the teacher intends them to learn from the teacher's demonstration so that they can focus their attention on some parts of the demonstration and not others. So here's the second wheel within a wheel here. It's like a miniature version of the big wheel within a wheel. I'm going to suggest one of the reasons why mind reading is especially interesting is because it contributes to teaching, but I'm also going to argue that the capacity to read minds is itself taught. We learn it through teaching. Now, my strategy for investigating whether mind reading is a product of cultural or biological evolution is to compare mind reading with print reading, with literacy. And I'm doing this because we can be fairly sure that print reading it's certainly a form of cultural learning. Most of us in this room, not true of all cultures, but most of us in this room, the knowledge of which we are most proud is the knowledge that we've got from reading print. So it's certainly a route to acquire the accumulated wisdom of previous generations. It's a form of cultural learning, print reading. But also we can be pretty confident that it's a culturally inherited form of cultural learning. It's only been around, reading and writing have only been around for between 5,000 and 6,000 years, and nearly everybody agrees that that's not long enough for biological evolution to have given us special psychological processes which enable us to learn how to read. So it's a kind of a proof of the principle that a form of cultural learning can itself be culturally inherited. Now, my challenge is, now we're moving on to the second part of the talk, this comparison between print reading and mind reading. Most psychologists believe that the capacity for mind reading, that we acquire it by virtue of an inborn, genetically inherited, specialized set of psychological processes. And to make room for my suggestion that instead we are taught to do it, I need to query some of the evidence which is put forward as a sign that we have an innate module for mind reading. And I do this by comparing mind reading with print reading. So the logic is, here's a feature of mind reading which has been taken to be evidence that the capacity for mind reading is inborn. But we find the same feature in print reading, and we know that the capacity for print reading doesn't develop by virtue of an inborn mechanism. So that feature can't be a sign of an inborn mechanism. That's the logic. Let me illustrate it with a couple of cases. Let's take neural specialization. So some people have suggested that because there are parts of the cortex that are specialized for mind reading, including the temporal parietal junction, which is shown here, then it's very likely that the capacity for mind reading, that its development is guided by an inborn process, a specialized process. But that argument doesn't really work because there's also parts of the cortex which are specialized for print reading. And we know that the development of print reading isn't guided by an innate module. There's an area of the occipitotemporal cortex which is so reliably active when a literate person is shown print that it is known as the visual word form area. Here's a second example of this analogical strategy to kind of make room for my hypothesis. This relates to genetically heritable disorders. So some people have argued, look, people with autism spectrum conditions have a specific, many of them have a specific difficulty in understanding thoughts and feelings, in interpreting their own behavior and that of other people in terms of thoughts and feelings, and have thought that suggests that the capacity for mind reading is genetically inherited. But can that really be right, given that people with dyslexias have a specific impairment in print reading? And we know that print reading is culturally rather than genetically inherited. And a final example, which look at a little more closely because I think it is intriguing, is to do with cultural diversity. So it has been argued that print reading shows huge cultural diversity. For example, look at this range of different scripts here. Some of them much more kind of square and blocky, others much more kind of circular and flowing. There's lots of cross-cultural variation in scripts. And yet people say, with mind reading, all cultures have the basic idea that there's such a thing as mental states, as thoughts and feelings, and that those mental states play some causal role in behavior. So they'd say, that is evidence that mind reading is quite different from print reading. Mind reading, cross-culturally universal. Print reading, cross-culturally diverse. But if you look more closely, and in particular at the ethnographic literature, looking at cultures which have been minimally influenced by the American European culture, then you find there's actually a lot of diversity in mind reading. So, for example, there's an excellent review by Lillard looking at cultures minimally influenced, and she found variation on a number of dimensions. For example, supernatural causation. There are many cultures that believe that, for example, we might regard as supernatural causation. They wouldn't see it that way. Cultures believe that dead people have mental states. The Micronesian, if we look as one specific example, who believe that your negative emotions, anger and sadness, can cause illness in your relatives, even if you have no physical or communicational contact with your relatives. We would see that as supernatural causation. Another dimension of variation is internality and dominance. There are cultures that believe that some mental states reside outside the body, and there's variation in which sense is seen as dominant. Some cultures see olfaction as dominant, some audition. We, of course, are apt to see vision as dominant. Negative emotions, culture in Tahiti and also in Victorian England, that played down negative emotions like anger to such an extent regarded them as so taboo, as it were, that it constituted a variation in theory of mind, or mind reading. And finally, a variable which I think is particularly interesting, which is the extent to which a culture regards mental states rather than situations as causes of behavior. So an illustration of this is a study by Howell with the Chiwong in Malaysia, where he spent 17 months with the sole purpose of uncovering all of their mental state terms, all of the words that they use for mental states. And he found only 5. And those were loosely translated want very much, forget, remember, and a 5th one I've forgotten. I'm sorry about that. And looking for emotion terms, he found only 23 emotion terms, whereas there's more than 2,000 in English. Now, that evidence suggests that these people see your social role and the situation in which you find yourself as the primary causes of behavior, rather than what you think and feel and want. And increasingly now, there is experimental laboratory evidence from studies with children which is backing up this ethnographic evidence. So, for example, a study by Sheehan in 2011, which compared children from China and Iran with children from the US and Australia in terms of the development of different components of mind reading, and found that in individualist cultures, the US and Australia, children understood that people can have different opinions about things. They can have diverse beliefs before they understood that it might be that one person is right and another person is wrong. Those stages were reversed in the children from China and Iran, where individualism and self-expression aren't such sacred cows. There, children first understood that a person may be right or wrong, and later came to understand that people may have different opinions about a matter. Okay. So, I've argued that these are 3 examples of things which have been put forward as evidence that our capacity for mind reading is inborn: neural specialization, developmental disorders, autism in particular, and absence of cultural diversity. And I've argued in the first that in all 3 cases, print reading is like mind reading, and therefore these don't constitute very good evidence that mind reading is inborn, because we know that print reading isn't. But now, many people would say, aha, but this parallel between mind reading and print reading breaks down when you think about non-human animals and babies. They would say, we know that babies and non-human animals can't read print, but they would cite recent studies which they see as providing evidence that non-human animals and babies are capable of a variety of mind reading. Now, unfortunately, it wouldn't make for a very engaging talk if I were to go through the contents of these 3 review papers that I've written recently. What these papers do is to review the putative evidence of some automatic or implicit form of mind reading in non-human animals, in infants, and in adults. And analyzing these data carefully, I suggest in each case that what seems to be evidence of automatic mind reading is in fact due to the operation of domain-general psychological mechanisms. It's due to the operation of kinds of thinking that we apply to inanimate objects as well as to other people. So this is not mind reading. This is not specialized thinking in terms of what another person is thinking and feeling. Now, that kind of close work, as I say, I can't go through 50 studies and say, here's the alternative explanation in terms of domain-general thinking. But I can show you one example of how this kind of argument goes relating to adults. So the putative evidence of implicit or automatic mind reading in babies and in animals has been supported by apparent demonstrations that we adults remain capable of an automatic or involuntary form of mind reading. That it might be that most of our mind reading is quite conscious and deliberate, but that there's another kind of mind reading or a facet of the same capacity which is operating in us automatically. And here's an example of a study which seems to provide evidence of automatic mind reading in adults. The original study was by Dana Sampson and Ian Apperley in Birmingham. And in this very nice experiment, this very nice paradigm that they developed, imagine you were a subject in this experiment. On each trial, you would be shown an image like this on a computer screen, and you would be asked to make a speeded response confirming the number of dots that you can see on the computer screen. So the correct answer in this particular example would be 2. But on some trials, there's always, in this experiment, a human-like figure on the screen, what they call an avatar. And your response, confirming that there's 2 dots that you can see on the screen, would be faster in this condition, where the avatar, facing this way, can see the same number of dots as you, than you would be in this condition where the avatar can only see 1 dot and you can see 2 dots. That incompatibility between what you can see and what the avatar can see seems to be slowing you down. So they interpreted this as evidence that we can't help ourselves thinking about what it is that another person can see, even if representing what another person can see slows you down, it stops you from doing what you intend to do, you can't stop yourself from representing what another individual can see. But and we did this experiment, I did this experiment in collaboration with Idalmis Santiesteban, who's shown in the top right-hand corner there, and Jeff Bird and a number of others. We had the idea that, in fact, this effect could instead be due to domain-general processes of attention which operate whether you're dealing with animate or inanimate stimuli, and specifically that the directional properties of the avatar, this avatar has the directional property of pointing this way, that directional property of the avatar promotes privileged processing of the stimuli in the indicated direction. And when the number of stimuli in the indicated direction is different from the total number on the screen, your instructions, remember, are to report the total number of the screen, then you get conflict between these 2 processes. Doing what you were told to do, counting the total number on the screen, and privileged processing of the items in front of the directional stimulus creates conflict and therefore slows you down. So to test that domain-general, not mind-reading explanation, what we did was to repeat the experiment, including the trials with the avatar, but then adding trials in which the avatar was replaced with an inanimate stimulus, an arrow. Now, of course, arrows are not appropriate objects for the attribution of mental states, including seeing. And as our domain-general hypothesis predicted, we got exactly the same effect, the same slowing of reaction times in the arrow condition as in the avatar condition when the directional stimulus was pointing to a different number of dots than the total number on the screen. So I hope that gives you a flavor of how putative evidence of mind reading in babies and infants, which, if valid, would be a disanalogy with print reading, how it can be understood as clever use, as it were, of domain-general mechanisms, not as mind reading in good standing. Okay, so that's, as it were, sort of the defensive part of my strategy, trying to loosen up this sense that there may be such strong evidence that we have an inborn capacity for mind reading, that there is room to give proper consideration to the positive evidence that we are taught to read minds. And I want to show you 2 or 3 examples of that positive evidence. Can I just check how long I've got? Oh, I've lost Nick. 5 more minutes. Okay, fine. Here's one piece, and what I like about this is that this study suggests that when mothers are talking to their infants, they structure the infant's experience of talk about mental states such that infants are exposed to easy mental states before they are exposed to hard mental states. In the same way that if you're teaching a child to read print, you expose them to easy-to-read words before you expose them to hard-to-read words. And this study by Tomopo and Ruffman was longitudinal. It recorded conversations between mothers and their infants at different points in time, and they recorded the frequency with which the mother was using various kinds of mental state verbs in her conversation with her child. And what they found was that when they recorded these conversations when the child was 15 months old, that mothers were using many more words for desires and emotions than they were using words for thoughts and knowledge. And it was the frequency with which the mothers talked about desires and emotions that predicted how good the children were at understanding mental states and identifying emotions from facial expressions later on at 24 months old. So mothers who used, the children of mothers who used lots of words for desires and emotions were better at mind reading than the children whose mothers used fewer words for desires and emotions. But how often the mothers talked about thoughts and knowledge didn't predict the child's mind reading capacity at 24 months. In contrast, when they recorded conversations between mothers and their children at 24 months old, they found the mothers were talking much more about thoughts and knowledge than they were about desires and emotions, and it was the frequency with which the mothers talked about thoughts and knowledge that predicted mind-reading performance later on at 31 months. Now, desires and emotions are easier for children to understand than thoughts and knowledge because young children are constantly trying to fulfill their desires, as it were. They have lots of them. They're dominant in their mental lives. And emotions commonly have typical facial expressions associated with them. So identifying when somebody is in a particular emotional state is easier than identifying when somebody is thinking a particular thing. So this study suggests that just as when teaching a child to read print, we expose them to easy words before hard words, mothers are exposing children to easy mental state terms before they expose them to hard mental state terms. And let me mention briefly another study of a similar kind where mother-child conversations were recorded while the mother and child were looking at a picture book together. And what this adds is evidence that it's not just the frequency with which mothers use mental state terms that has an impact on the development of mind reading. It seems that also mothers in particular, but parents, caregivers, are explicitly instructing children in causal relations between behavior and mental states and among mental states. Just the same way as when you teach a child to read, you specify grapheme-phoneme correspondences. So you might tell them that T-I-O-N, what looks like that, sounds like shun. That would be a grapheme-phoneme correspondence rule. Similarly, it looks like mothers are instructing children on kind of behavior, mental state mappings. Because when they recorded these conversations while looking at a picture book, what Slaughter and her colleagues found was that it was the amount of causal explanatory talk by the mother that predicted how good these 4- and 5-year-olds were on a false belief task, on understanding that beliefs need not match physical reality. So when mothers used, this is a particularly complex example, when mothers said things like this, she, the protagonist in the story, didn't see them playing, so she will not know who messed up her dressing table. The more mothers used phrases like that, or the more mother said, he is smiling because he is happy because he is playing with the dog, rather than, oh look, he's smiling, which is not giving a causal explanatory statement relating behavior to mental state. The more the mothers used these causal explanatory statements, the better the children were in mind reading. And let me mention one other, no, I won't. Well, yes, I will. Okay, yes, I will. Mention one more study, and then I'll finish. This is a natural experiment, and is partly intriguing for that reason. The natural experiment was the development, the spontaneous development among hearing-impaired people in Nicaragua in the 1970s of a new sign language. And Páez and Sengas worked with 2 groups of people who had learned and used as their only language Nicaraguan Sign Language. Their first cohort of people learned Nicaraguan Sign Language when it was in its early stages. It was very rudimentary. The second cohort learned Nicaraguan Sign Language when it was much more highly developed. And with these 2 groups of people, they measured 2 things. How much mental state language the person had, how many signs for mental states the person had, and also how good they were on a non-verbal false belief task. And they measured that at 2 time points, in 2001 and in 2003. And what they found was, in 2001, the first cohort, the people who had learned NSL when it was at the rudimentary stage, had very few signs for mental states compared with the second cohort, and correspondingly, their performance was very poor on the nonverbal false belief task. 2 years later, when to some extent the first cohort had caught up in having signs for mental states, they had correspondingly caught up in their understanding of false belief. Now, for me, what's most interesting about this is to reflect on the fact that the people in the first cohort were on average 10 years older than the people in the second cohort. They were all adults when the study was done, but those in the first cohort were on average 10 years older. So if our knowledge of mental states came from introspection, as it were, from looking inward, or if, as it were, we learned it by our own devices, by watching other people's behavior and hatching a theory about what causes that behavior, if either of those were the source of our knowledge of mental states, the first cohort had had 10 more years in which to do those things, and therefore should have been a lot better than the second cohort. Instead, what predicted mental state understanding, and specifically false belief understanding, was mental state language, okay? The kind of thing that they could get only through conversation with others. So, I've suggested as part of this larger project on the cultural inheritance of cultural learning that mind reading is something where there's a genetic contribution, but it's much smaller and less specific than has previously been assumed, that mind reading contributes to cultural evolution, but also it is itself a product of cultural evolution. It's something which we are taught to do. And what are the implications of this? Very briefly, going outside my comfort zone, I think there's 2 of them. One is, if the mechanisms of cultural inheritance are themselves culturally inherited, things can improve and decline a lot faster than if those mechanisms of cultural learning are inborn. So in one of those nightmare catastrophe, apocalyptic scenarios where there is some mass epidemic, as it were, that decimates the world that we know, we would have a lot more trouble recovering than would typically be thought, because it's not only the danger that we would forget how to make things, that we would forget facts about the world, that they would be lost from the culture pool. The danger is that we would lose the capacity to learn those kinds of things from others. And the second, narrower, but still breathtakingly broad and outside my comfort zone implication, I suppose, is that if, as I suggest, mind reading is so much like print reading, why aren't we training people in schools to do mind reading the way that we do with print reading? Perhaps it's important enough to make it worth doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Wish we had more time. We have time for some questions. Would anyone like to ask one?
Thank you for absolutely fascinating talk. I really have two questions, but I'll stick to one. I wondered if empathy seems to be something that we talk about a great deal, and whether that is some sort of mind reading in the emotional domain, or whether it's the implicit and explicit aspects of that. Would you have thoughts on that?
Good point. I think I'm not radical in thinking that there's two kinds of empathy. I mean, sometimes it's called affective and cognitive, isn't it? That contrast between the two. Now, whether it's exactly what I have in mind, I'm not sure. It seems to me that we can be influenced by somebody else's emotional state. I mean, if we see a facial expression of disgust, as it were, it can provoke in us a feeling of disgust. I would see that as a kind of a contagious effect. We don't need to conceptualize what the other person is feeling. We don't even need necessarily to appreciate that they're feeling anything at all. The pure expression on their face, as it were, might induce in me a feeling of disgust. So I would see that as not necessarily involving mind reading. And then I think a higher form of empathy, or a more complex form of empathy, in which there is the involvement of interpreting what it is that I see somebody else doing in terms of what are their mental states, and then perhaps having an empathetic response to that interpretation of what's going on inside them. So I think that kind involves mind reading, but I don't see empathy as necessarily involving mind reading.
Courtney.
Hi, thanks.
Hi.
Again for a fascinating talk. I do a lot of autism research, so interested in that piece of it, particularly because I think there are lots of programs now for teaching mind reading, and I think you can teach kids to get a bit better at doing false belief tasks. But the leap from being able to reason about other people's minds and then applying that day to day in the heat of the moment, that seems to break down, and that seems much harder to do. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Obviously, those children get rich input from their families. They often hear talk about mental states. You can train them to get better at false belief tasks, but
Yeah.
applying it is difficult.
I think my story absolutely accepts that people with autism spectrum conditions have something genetically inherited which is interfering with their learning of mind reading. And clearly, candidates are their early problems with joint attention, the different ways in which they scan faces relative to neurotypical controls. Now, those things could they could mean that they have an incredibly rich environment, as it were, offering to teach them how to do this, but they're dealing with other people, their low-level reactions to other people are such that they're not picking it up the way that everybody else does. So I don't think my view would necessarily predict that, you know, it's going to be easy, it's going to be possible to just kind of sort out the difficulties that people with autism have with mind reading.
I guess the question is more generally, can you teach it?
Can you teach it?
If you don't have it, can it be taught? Or if you haven't been able to learn from these kind of general all-purpose mechanisms? One to think about, I guess.
Well, yeah, it's one to think about whether there are demonstrations of it. I think some of the evidence that I showed at the end, and also now there's also studies showing cross-cultural variation, you know, so immigrant populations varying in the degree of mental state language that they use, and that correlating with the rate of development of their children's theory of mind. And I wouldn't want to doubt that if they were just exposed to a different frequency of using the host culture's theory of mind, that they would pick it up the way that anybody else would. Yeah.
Maybe we
It's a
can
kind of a
do-
test case of whether you find my thesis plausible, I think. And I understand entirely if you don't. Good.
One more question? Yes, Amina.
Some people have speculated that there's a connection between mindfulness and reading.
I'd be inclined to see, it's very interesting, I hadn't put the two together. I'd be inclined to see mindfulness as like, you know, the PhD of mind reading. I mean, that process where, you know, trying to differentiate very finely different emotional states, to relate them to bodily states, and so on, yeah, is like a very advanced form of mind reading, yeah. And may actually also highlight cross-cultural differences in mind reading. So it's clearly influenced by the Buddhist tradition, which is a somewhat different kind of theory of mind than the one that we're influenced by in this culture now.
Okay, well, if you have more questions, we will have a drinks reception immediately after this seminar. It'll be in the common room, the psychology building, the Wolfson building. I think there's room 227. It's right in the stairwell. And we can continue chatting with Cecilia there. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.